Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf Mem Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Ruchi Summer in loving memory of Ronnie Summer, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Avraham, on his 20th year at site. He continues to inspire his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to be kind, curious, and loving. His love for his family brought him tremendous nachat. May his neshama have an aliyah. Okay, we're going to get started. A lot of technical stuff today, but with that, a few kind of interesting things to make the daf a little bit more exciting than just talking about treifot. So we're going to start with Ulla. We had yesterday the list of 18 treifot. We had different ways of organizing the list, different ways of categorizing, because in the end we had this list of 18 that was mentioned in our Mishnah, and then we had another 4 and another 7. So how we reconcile all that with this fact that Rabbi Yishmael says there's 18, so we came up with ways to categorize them. Continuing in the categorization comes Ulla and says, Amar Ulla, shmona minei treifot ne'emru lo Moshe b'Sinai. Okay, now again, we go back to this idea that these were passed down to Moshe at Sinai. And what were they? 8 different kinds. So we're going to categorize them in 8 different ways, basically saying there's all different kinds of things that could happen to an animal that can make the animal a treifa. We have nekuva, a perforation, pesuka, a cut, netula, a part that's taken out, removed, chasura, missing a part, kru'a, right? I think netula is more like taken out of its place, and chasura is missing completely. Kru'a, torn. Drusa, attacked, like clawed by an animal. Nefula, fallen, that we have falling off the roof. And shevura, broken. Okay, so there's all different, these are the 8 different types. Now, why did he put this into the number 8? Well, the assumption is that he was probably trying to exclude something. What was he excluding? And you can go back and figure out there's one case that we mentioned that doesn't fit into any of these categories. La fuge lekuta de rachesh bar papa. In one of the 7 shmatata, which again, what about the 7 shmatata? They were 7 examples, right? There's a book called the Shev Shmatata, which was named after this, which was written by the same person who wrote the Ktsot. In any case, that's just information. It was 7 statements of Amoraim who added to the Tanaitic literature that there was also, right, these other 7 treifot, and one of them was this disease in the kidneys that Rachesh Bar Papa was talking about, which he doesn't agree with, obviously, because he doesn't say there's lakuta, which would have been another category. Amar Chiya barvav, shmona treifot yesh b'nekuva. Okay, now how many are there in the nekuva category? Now we saw this yesterday. We had the veshet, the krom shalmoch, the lev, the re'ah, the keva, the dakim, the kares pnimi, the hemses, and the beta kosot. Okay, so that was right. Veshet, krom shalmoch, I think I counted poorly. Lev, the heart, right? The re'ah, the keva, the dakim, the kares pnimi, the hemses, and the beta kosot. Wow, how did I get to 9? Shouldn't be 9. Wow, I don't know what I just did wrong. There should be 8 there. Okay, must have counted something wrong. Okay, maybe that's why, because the hemses, beta kosot are counted as 1. That's why. Okay, so there's 8. If you count the hemses and beta kosot as 1, there's 8. So now, im tomar tesha. Now we also had the tchol, which we added of Rav Avira, but we're not talking about that one right now. But if you want to say there's 9, again, the 8 means not 9. Mara, Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda katanila. Well, the mara is another one. Okay, we yesterday didn't have the mara on that list of all the nekuvot when we put them all together, because we said that Rabbi Yishmael doesn't hold by the mara. Remember, he switched the charuta with the mara. So the gallbladder is only, okay, the fact that we have a perforation in the gallbladder will make it a problem. That's only Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda's position, which we mentioned yesterday. Tanya, as it says in the Braita, how do we know? Now, yesterday we didn't mention how we know that it's his opinion. They just stated it. Now we're going to see a Braita where he disagrees with the rabbis. Nikva keva, vit nikvua dakin, treifa. And you'll notice Tanakama doesn't say anything about the mara. But Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer af nikva hamara. He says even the gallbladder is a problem. So we're basically saying we have this list of Ulla, which excludes the Rachesh Bar Papa's opinion about the disease in the kidney. And Chiya bar Rav says there's shmona treifot in a nekuva, and he's basically excluding the case of Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda, of the gallbladder. Now, this leads us to Rabbi Yitzchak. This statement, Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which is going to lead us to 5 statements he makes. The first 2 are really connected to each other, and then he makes another 3 about different treifot. So the first one he says is halakha Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, against Chiya bar Rav, who didn't mention Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda's position, he thinks a perforation in the gallbladder is a problem. V'amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef amar Rabbi Yochanan. This is going to be the first interesting part in today's daf. Maya hadru lechavre Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda. So he says, okay, so again, like I said, all these statements are going to be Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. He says, what do you think the students of the friends, the colleagues of Rabbi Yosi Rabbi Yehuda who didn't agree with him, what do you think they said to him? So he says their proof was, now whether they said this or not, we don't know. Either he has a tradition that this is what they said, or, because remember, they are Moraim and the previous ones are Tanaim, or he's kind of making up, what kind of proof could each side bring. So where are they going to bring a proof for this? Is the gallbladder, does it render an animal a treifa? Well, they're going to bring it from Iyov. Okay, let's remember the story of Iyov, right? There's this whole beginning where the Satan goes to God and says, you think Iyov's so great, and it's just because, his life is good. And then basically they make a deal, and the Satan basically is going to bring all these bad things upon Iyov and see what happens. So besides him losing his family and all sorts of things like that, he also suffers physically. And in one of the descriptions Iyov makes about the struggles and the suffering he's going through, he says, Yishpoch la'aretz mirerati. Okay, my mirerati, which is my gallbladder, is strewn on the floor. Okay, thrown on the floor, which means like he doesn't really have a gallbladder. Okay, it's completely ruined. Okay, the beginning of the pesuka is Yispu alai rabav, like all these bad things will happen. Yifalech kilyotai v'lo yachmol. God will destroy my kidneys without chemla, without having any pity for me. Yishpoch la'aretz mirerati, and will, throws my gallbladder on the ground. Now, why is this a proof? Well, that's not a treifa. How do we know it's not a treifa? Because Iyov, ve'adayin Iyov kayam. Iyov is still living, right? He survives. So you must be able to survive even with a problem in the gallbladder. Proven from Iyov. Okay, there's going to be some issues with this. Before we get to the issues, I just want to point out at this point, it obviously is based on the mainstream opinion that we talked about yesterday, that a treifa is Chiya, right? A treifa can survive. And Gefet for this week is about this issue. I'm actually not sure. I'm trying to remember if the English went up. It might not have gone up yet. Hopefully, if it didn't, it will go up at some point. But it's on this topic of this big machloket, treifa Chiya, treifa ain't Chiya, which is a very strange machloket because, and that's what Rabbi Shimoni delves into in the Gefet, which is, it's up now for sure in the Hebrew. I just don't think it might have, I'm not sure if it went up in English. Anyway, the point is the idea of the shir is really trying to get at, why don't they just check the animals, right? Like, figure out, do animals survive for 12 months with these defects or not, right? It's kind of like it's always strange when the rabbis have an argument about something that could actually be checked out in reality. So that makes it an intriguing machloket and need to delve in further and understand it better. So now we have this case of Iyov. He still survives, and that's why you see that the gallbladder being a problem is not a defect. Amar lahem. So what's Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda's retort, according to this Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef saying in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? He says, okay, here's the interesting part of today's daf, or the first one, which is, well, Iyov was a miracle. Okay, that wasn't normal that his gallbladder was strewn on the floor and he survived. That was just a miracle. Now, if you're not going to tell me it was a miracle, and maybe you can survive without the gallbladder, if God destroys his kidneys without mercy, can you survive mikachaya? No one can survive without kidneys. Okay, nowadays, dialysis, there's other things in those days without dialysis, right? You can't survive without kidneys. Ela nisa shane. It must have been a miracle, and then this is just a miracle. Now, what is this miracle based on? Well, dichtiv rak et nafsho shmor. Now, I mentioned before that God made this deal with the Satan. Okay, you can do this to him. But the deal was, Vayomer Hashem ala Satan in Iyov chapter 2, verse 6, Ki no biyadecha. Okay, I'm giving you Iyov to do whatever you want to him. Ach et nafsho shmor. But don't let him die, right? It's like when you arrest people and say, don't kill them though. We need them alive. Okay, don't let him die. Whatever you do to him, you can make him suffer, but don't let him die. And therefore, it was a miracle. In other words, he was able to do all these things as long as he kept him alive. But that was because he was kept alive in some miraculous manner. So therefore, hachanami nisa shani. And therefore, we're going to say this doesn't prove anything about a gallbladder issue in an animal because you can't learn from miracles. right? It's interesting, by the way, that we can learn from humans to animals, right? Which parts of the body are essential, which aren't. That makes a lot more sense. But we definitely can't learn from miracles or miraculous situations. Okay, moving on now to the second. It's really the third statement, but again, the second statement of his was really just connected to the halakha like Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda, and then he went in depth into what was the conversation that ensued. So I'm not going to count that as 2, that'll be 1. Now we're up to number 2. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, right? They're all going to be statements by Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef in the name of Rabbi Yochanan about a treifa. Halakha kedivrei ha'omer kizayid. The halakha is like the one who says kizayid. Okay, we don't know what they're talking about, but in a second we'll see that they're talking about the liver. If you're left with a piece of your liver that's less than an olive bulk, it's a problem. But if it's still an olive bulk, it's fine. So basically the halakha is like the one who says that if you're left with less than a kazayit, that's a treifa. Now, how could you quote Rabbi Yochanan as saying this? Don't we know? Now, this contradicts our Mishnah. Remember what the Mishnah said? If you have no part of your liver, right, the animal has no part of the liver left, it's a treifa. But this one says, if it has less than an olive bulk, it's a treifa. That's not the same. And, okay, so now maybe he could say, look, I hold by a different Tanaitic opinion. But what's the problem? Because he says, I hold like the one who says kazayit. So he is saying, I hold like a different Tanaitic opinion. Okay, you can go against the Mishnah, but what do we know about Rabbi Yochanan? We said this many, many, many times. How could Rabbi Yochanan say this? Ha'amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Bar Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, halakha kistam Mishnah. We paskin like an unattributed Mishnah. If we have a Mishnah without a machloket and no opinion, it just says it. Stam, without any name, we paskin like that. Rabbi Yochanan does. Rabbi Bar Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, we paskin like a stam Mishnah. So if Rabbi Yochanan paskins like a stam Mishnah, how could he paskin now against a stam Mishnah? And Tnan, in case you didn't remember, they tell you, netula kaveh v'lo nisheir himenu klum. If nothing is left, it's a treifa. But if something's left, if it's less than an olive bulk, it's not a treifa. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, it is a treifa. So, right, hanish tayer, if something was left, you can infer from our Mishnah, it would be kshera. Afagav de lo ave kazayid, even if it's not an olive bulk. So that's a contradiction, to which they answer their classic answer when they ask these kind of questions. And often they ask this against Rabbi Yochanan, because what do you mean? Every time Rabbi Yochanan seems to pass against the Stam Mishnah, we have a problem with that principle. Instead of saying, there's a few exceptions to the rule, but they don't say that. They say, Emorai nekuva libet de Rabbi Yochanan. We have a machloket between Amoraim, this Rabbi Yitzchak, Baal Yosef, versus Rabbi Bar Chana about what Rabbi Yochanan said. Okay, which happens often that students come out each thinking different things. Okay, it says de amar, which should be a continuation of the previous, but it shouldn't be. It's corrected in a bunch of places. It says ve amar, and he said. Again, we're going to have another statement. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, mara shenikva v'kaved sotam tak shera. If you have a gallbladder with a hole, now he already said it was a problem, but if the liver, which is adjacent to the gallbladder, if right where the liver is adjacent to the gallbladder, the liver covers up the hole, then basically nothing can pass through that hole, and therefore it's not a problem. Okay? And therefore it's kshira. And one last case is going to say, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Nikev ha-korkevan, this is the gizzard of the animal, the gizzard of the bird, V'kis shelo kayam kasher. The korkevan is a rounded part, it's like where the food goes into and gets processed. And the inner lining is intact. So you have a perforation in the outside of the korkevan, but there's this inner lining. If the inner lining, we're going to talk about this now in 2 different cases, there's an inner lining, so if there's no perforation in the inner lining, then nothing can go in and out, and it's totally fine. So that's going to be a kosher animal. Remember, this is all after you slaughter the animal. You see the insides, and you see that this is what it looks like. There's perforation on the outside, but the inner lining is intact. It's totally fine. Now they ask a question. What if nikev hakis v'korkevan kayam mai? What if the inner lining has a perforation, but the outer part doesn't? So tashma, let's learn from here, which is kind of obvious. To Amar Rav Nachman, nikev ze below ze kashir. Okay, if one, it doesn't matter which one, because you have 2 layers here. If one layer is perforated, the other one's not, it doesn't matter which one. Okay, but now Rabba's going to come. Amar Rabba. Shnei orot yesh lo levesh. This is going to have all sorts of relevancies in today's daf. There's 2 parts of the veshet. There's 2, they call it orot, but it's 2 parts of the veshet. This is the esophagus or gullet, as we call it. Chitzon adom, the outer part. There's 2 layers, basically. The outer part is red, upnimi lavan, and the inner part is white. Nikev ze below ze kashil. Okay, now, later we'll get to why they told us red, why they told us white. It's going to be the next line. But right now, let's just understand there's two linings. There's a lining or an inner part and the outer part. And same thing as the korkavan is the gizzard. If there's a perforation in one and not the other, it's fine because nothing can go in and out, basically. Okay? And therefore, it's not an issue. Why does he have to tell us this, Rabbi? That, okay, well, what we need to know exactly the physiology, what it looks like, right? Why is he telling us the outer part is red and the inner part is white? Treifa. Well, if it's flipped, it's a treifa. Now, they don't really mean flip completely, that the red turns to white, because that doesn't really happen. But if the white part becomes red, what's it a sign of? It's a sign that the animal was a drusa, it was kind of clawed by some other animal, and the white part turned red from blood. That's what usually internal bleeding. Okay, so it's a sign of internal bleeding, and therefore, right, they also, Rashi talks about this. Eris, possibly that there was this poison that went into it from the drusa, and maybe it's from the poison. Either which way, it's a sign of something gone wrong. It shouldn't be red on the inside. So again, if you saw the animal, you find it's red on the inside, it's a treifa. Okay, that's not connected to the nikev ze below ze. That's just why did he tell us that the outside is red and the inside is white? Now we have a question. Now we have these two cases, the gizzard and the gullet. That each one has two layers. If one is perforated, the other one isn't, it's not a problem. But if both are, it's a problem. Now we say, what if they're both perforated but not, right, what's the reason? If both are perforated, then there's a complete hole all the way through. But what if they're not in the same location? One's high up and one's low down. Then theoretically, stuff can't get through. Or maybe it can, and that's the question. So we're going to have two opinions here. Amar Mar Zutra Mishmei de Rav Papa. Mar Zutra says in the name of Rav Papa, Beveshet kasher bekorkavan pasul. When it's in the gullet, it's fine because it's not going to be able to get from one to the other. Nothing's going to be able to pass by. But in the korkavan, it's disqualified because in the korkavan, that's where the food stays, and then the food could move theoretically through one hole and then move down in between and get through the other hole. Apparently, that's what Mar Zutra seems to say. Okay, I say that because just hold off for 1 minute. Right? He doesn't really explain, but that seems to be the explanation. Rashi helps us with that. Matkifla Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, Adraba, what do you mean? It's the complete opposite. Veshet da'achlabe upayabe ravach. The veshet, because you eat with, because that's where close to your throat, right? It goes from the jawbone down to, we're going to learn today about the torbat haveshet, which is right in between the jawbone and the veshet. And then we have the gullet, right? The veshet. So it's right where you eat and where you make sounds come out of. And therefore it's ravach. It expands. Okay, it's flexible. So gandale upashale. Sometimes it shrinks a little, sometimes it expands a little. And because of that, imagine if it expands, then things move around. Where the hole is now is not where the hole maybe was 10 minutes ago or half an hour ago. So if you see these two perforations that are not right near each other, it could be at some point they were, and that would make the animal a treifa. But korkavan demena, and therefore zimnin demehandazin bahade. Sometimes they'll end up lining up exactly one opposite the other. But korkavan demenach nayich kedekaikai. But the korkavan doesn't move around. Those different parts don't move in different ways. So it's stable in its place, and therefore there's no movement, and therefore two holes not opposite each other are not going to be considered like one big hole. And therefore the animal will be kosher. So he says the exact opposite of what Rav Mar Zutra said. Amarle Rav Acha bered Rav Yosef le Rav Ashi. Comes Rav Acha, the son of Rav Yosef, and says to Rav Ashi, Hachi Amrina Mishmei de Mar Zutra de Amr Mishmei de Rav Papa Kavatech. I have what my tradition is, that Mar Zutra said in the name of Rav Papa exactly like you said, and that there's actually no disagreement. So there's a debate about whether Mar Zutra completely disagrees with him or completely agrees with him. Okay, next, we're going to have a few statements of Rabbah. Amar Rabbah. Chum sha'ala machmat makaba veshet eno chum. If you have a perforation, and then there was a wound there, and it scabbed up, okay, before we had the liver, right, coming up against the gallbladder and basically sealing up the hole because of its proximity. Here we say no. Even though you have something covering up the hole, if it's a scab, right, scabs are temporary, that's not considered covering up the hole. Basically, there's a perforation and the animal's a treifa. V'amar Rabba. This goes back to the red and the white. Okay, the fact that the veshet has the outer part is red, the inner part is white. Amar Rabba, veshet ein lo b'dikami b'chutz ela bifnim. You can't check the outside. In other words, if you have a concern that maybe it's a drusa where it was clawed by an animal, you're looking for signs of blood. What's the problem? Right, internal bleeding. Well, the outside is red. You're not going to be able to tell from the outside if there's any blood. You'll only be able to tell if there was blood inside that the white turned red. Okay, that's what we were talking about before. So there's no way to check. So l'may nafkamina, why? Well, what he's saying is you can't check the outside, you can only check the inside. So l'may nafkamina, what's this going to help us for? Turning now to Amabet, l'safek drusa. If you have a concern, now what's a safek drusa? If you have, let's say, some animals, large animals, that were near a lion, and you're worried that maybe the lion clawed the animal. That's what we talked about in the Mishnah, about a drusa, right? Being attacked by a lion. So you have to check, was a safek drusa? So you check the inside, see if it's red. You won't be able to check on the outside because you won't see any signs of blood there. So they say, here was a case. Now remember what Rabbi said. Very carefully remember, you can't check the outside, you can only check the inside. And the other thing to tell you before we learn this is what was the relationship between Rabba with a hey and Abaye? Right? Rabba and Abaye were always arguing, but Rabba is in a different generation. He was a generation before. He adopted Abaye. Both his parents died. His mother in childbirth, his father before that. And right after he was conceived, the father died. And he was brought up by Rabba. And Rabba was also his teacher. So he was his teacher and also his quote-unquote father. So there was a case of a safek drusa. Da'ate l'kamei de Rabba. So we had an issue with the drusa. Right? He was worried maybe it was a drusa, like the animal was with these lions, and he had to check. Hava kabadik later again. The animal was shechted, and then he went to check. Now, where did he check? Right? The badik le Rabba leveshet me'abarai, from the outside. This seems strange. Rabba himself says you can't check it on the outside. So Amar le Abaye says to him, he catches him up on it, and he says, "V'hamar, but you are Huda Amar. You're the one who said veshet ein lo b'dikah mi bifnim. You can only check it on the inside. So how are you checking this on the outside? Or why are you?" So Rabba listens to him. Apche Rabba. He basically turns the veshet inside out and looks on the inside. Ubadke. And what did he happen to find? Ishtakachale trei korte dama. He finds 2 drops of blood. Vitarfa. And he says to this animal's a treifa. Now, something about this story didn't jive. Why was he checking the outside, and why did Abaye have to remind him? So Rabba nami lechidude la Abaye hu debaye. He was just trying to check Abaye, to test him. He wanted to see, was Abaye going to catch him on it? Was he paying attention? So that's why he started on the outside, so that Abaye would say, right, you always say on Pesach, so the children should ask, right? So he wanted to see, was Abaye really know his stuff? Okay, obviously, this must have been when Abaye was younger, right? And not once he became Abaye that we all know. Okay, nechmad. Amar Ulla. So that was the second cute thing about today's daf. Okay, the last is going to come at the very end, so stay tuned. Okay, Amar Ulla. Yashav lo kotz beveshet, ein chosheshim shema hivri. Okay, we're going to end this sugya by saying how animals eat thorns all the time, okay? So it's very common that you're going to find a thorn inside the animal. Now, what if it's sitting in the veshet? And when you have a thorn sitting in the veshet, in the gullet, then you basically have a hole there, right? The thorn is inside. But this thorn only is on the inside, and it didn't go through the outer part. Okay, now that should be fine then, right? Well, ein chosheshim shema hivri. Ulla says, well, you don't have to worry. You might have thought maybe it completely penetrated both the outer and the inner part of the veshet, but maybe it healed already, the outer part, and therefore you don't see a hole there anymore. So maybe you have to worry. So this would be what we call a safek, because you already have a thorn in there. Likely the thorn went all the way through. You don't see any signs of it, but maybe it already healed. So wouldn't you think you have to be stringent? Ulla says no, you don't. So now we're going to have 4 questions. There's a siman for them. Siman. 4 questions against Ulla, where we're going to bring other safek cases, and we're going to say, there we were stringent. Why wouldn't we be stringent here? Now, I just want to point out, if we're stringent, what would we say? Well, the problem here is, before, what did he do? He checked the inside, and he saw there was blood, then he knew it was a treifa. But here, it's the inside that has the perforation. So you have to check the outside, but there's no way to check the outside. So if you're going to be stringent, you're going to basically just call this animal a treifa, because there's no way to check it. So he says, don't call the animal a treifa, but we're trying to figure out why not. We're going to bring 4 cases where we have a suffix and we're stringent. So why are we being lenient here when we have a suffix and no way to check? Ulla, ma'ishnami suffix drusa. Now we just said about suffix drusa, what did Rabbah say? Check it from the inside, right? It has to be checked. And in this case, if it has to be checked, then you can't check it because there's no way to check it. The inside already has the perforation. The question is, to have one on the outside? There's no way to know. So we should be machmir and say this animal is forbidden to eat. Well, we're going to answer this one by saying, Kasavar Ulla ein choshishin l'safek drusa. We're going to have to say that Ulla obviously doesn't think you hold by that safek, and you don't, and therefore there's no question. Okay, we neutralize the question because if he doesn't hold like Rabbah, then there's no question. Okay, but the other 3 we're going to basically differentiate between the cases. If you had 2 pieces in front of you, one was chelev, which is forbidden fats, one was shuman, regular fats. We always talk about this case. What is it? The case of you have to bring an asham talui. You're not sure you ate one of them. You're not sure which one you ate. So you have to bring an asham talui. Okay, now, why? They were strict. You see, safek, and we make you bring it. So they say that's different from here. Hatam it chizak isura. There's a chezkat isur. Remember? There, we know there's chelev there. It's just a matter of did you eat it? So we're going to be more strict with you. In our case, what did we learn a while ago? That when you slaughter an animal, we assume the animal's kosher until you prove it was a treifa. Right? Once the shechita was kosher, we don't assume it was a treifa until you show it was a treifa. So here it's not itchazak isur because it's actually itchazak chasura because you already slaughtered the animal. Okay, 3rd question. If you slaughter with a knife, right, review of some sugya we saw, if you slaughter with a knife and then you find out the knife had a nick in it, so it's a problem. Meaning you find out later the knife had a nick, you have to retroactively say your slaughtering's no good. Well, that's because we have something very noticeable in the knife. We have this nick, and therefore we have to be concerned. Here you might say, well, you have a thorn. But they're not really so concerned that the thorn is going to necessarily pierce through. Okay, the concern of the thorn is not going to be the same as the concern of the nick, that maybe you turn the animal into a treifa as you were slaughtering. 4th and last question here. Now we have this principle. Okay, we'll review, even though we've seen this many times. If you have a doubt about something being impure, so if it's in the private domain, we're going to be strict. If it's in the public domain, we're going to be lenient. Why is that? It's all learned out from the sota, because the sota is called, is she nitma'a or not? So since they use the language of tuma, they learn out impurity, even though she's not impure in the same sense, but they learn out laws of impurity from the sota. Now, where is the sota going to be an issue? If the woman went alone and secluded with the man in a closed room, that's when we're concerned that something transpired. So only in a private domain is she going to be concerned that she's a sota. Public domain, no. So we're going to say the same thing for impurity. Impurity in a private domain is a problem, a suffix, we're going to rule stringently. In a public domain, it's going to be totally fine. So they start off with the private, and they say, well, so there we have a suffix, we're stringent. Okay, this has nothing to do with treifa. But they're saying, why don't we just say in our case, also, let's just assume treifa. And there's no chezkat isser, there's nothing, right? There's no chezkat tuma. It was just, okay, well, there's tuma there, and we don't know whether it touched, whether it didn't, and we're going to be strict in a private domain. So they say, it's kind of random. Why don't you compare it to a suffix in the public domain where actually we're going to be lenient? Okay, and they use that to basically reject this line of questioning. That's a very unique halakha that's derived from sota, and that's why it is as it is, and it doesn't teach you for anything else. Okay, next. Now, before we finish this section and move to our last section of today's daf, we have a debate about what Ulla was talking about. When we started Ulla, we said that he was talking about you have a thorn stuck in to the inside of the gullet, but didn't go through the outside, or at least not noticeably. And that's the question. Do you have to worry it went through the outside and already healed? And we don't worry about that. And that's what Ulla is telling us. But Yatavahume Rabbanan Kameja Rav Kahana. So there was a student or a rabbi sitting in front of Rav Kahana. We don't know his name. V'yatev ka'amal nimtzet itmar aval yashav cheshinan. He says, no, it's if you find a thorn in the gullet, not stuck in, but just inside the gullet, like going like in the same direction as the gullet, but not stuck into the gullet. That's what he was talking about. But yashav, if it was actually piercing the gullet, for sure it would be a problem. Cheshinan, we have to be strict, and that would undo all the questions, right? It would be, oh yeah, just like Safik here with strict, we're going to be strict. Also here we're going to be strict, and worry that maybe it went through and it just healed. Amarlu Rav Kahana, but when Rav Kahana heard this, he said, Lo titzitule, he said to the students, don't listen to this person, he's completely wrong. Yashav itmar. No, we're talking about where it was stuck in the gullet, and yet Ulla was lenient. Aval nimtzei lo itzrich le Ulla. If it was actually just found inside the gullet, not piercing it, no one would even, and Ulla wouldn't need to tell you that. It's completely obvious that that's not a problem. Why? And I told you this is going to be the last line of this section. Tekulu cheva barayata kotze achlan. Because all animals eat thorns, okay? All wild animals that are out in the wild, they eat all sorts of things at the ground. There's thorns everywhere. They're constantly eating thorns. Ulla doesn't need to tell us that it's okay if you find a thorn in the gullet, because that's like what we call masim b'chol yom. Almost every time you're going to slaughter an animal, there's going to naturally be thorns in there. And Ulla doesn't need to tell you that's okay. Otherwise, we would have almost no kosher animals. So it must be he was talking about a case where it had already perforated. It just hadn't perforated all the way through. And then he basically rejects this other person's understanding of what they thought Ulla was saying. Now we get to this last subject, which is going to continue into tomorrow's daf, of torbat haveshet. Okay? Itmar. Torbat haveshet. What is the torbat haveshet? It's this area between it connects between the jawbone and the gullet. Okay, so it's right at the end of the throat, going into the gullet / esophagus. Okay, it's this part called the torbat haveshet. Now the big debate between Rav and Shmuel here it's a two-pronged debate, because is it considered the part of the veshet, or is it not considered part of the veshet? Okay, you see from its name that it's a little tricky, because it's the torbats of the veshet. Do we consider this part of the veshet to mean that you can slaughter there? It's a kosher place for shechita, or is it off? Is it not the place for shechita? And then, if it's the veshet, then any sort of perforation is going to be a problem. If it's not the veshet, because remember, that was the first on our list, nekuva haveshet, any teeny perforation. As opposed to if it's not part of the veshet, then you're going to need something much more to create, right? It's going to have to be, let's say, rove, the majority will have to be cut in order for it to be considered a treifa. So it has two ramifications. Number one, can you slaughter there? And number two, and they're interconnected. If you can slaughter there, then it's part of the veshet. Then it's going to be a nekev of any size that's going to disqualify it for loss of treifa. So we'll get into all this shortly. Torbat saveshet. Rav amar b'mashu, Shmuel amar b'rubo. So right now they're just having an argument about what size perforation is going to be a problem. Rav says any little bit. Shmuel says majority. Rav amar b'mashu. Why? Because makom shchitu. Okay, like I said, they're interconnected. It's mashu because it's part of the veshet. If it's part of the veshet, it's a makom shchita. This is a place where you can actually slaughter the animal there. Ushmuel amar b'rubo lav makom shchitu. He says no. It has to be a treifa. It has to be the majority because it's not the place for shechita. Okay, so now they ask, "Hey, niu torbat haveshet." Okay, they weren't sure exactly where this is. Where is it? Amar Rav Meri, Mar Ukva, Amar Shmuel, Kosher Tochvo Umarchiv. And how do you know what they're really talking about? Is how do you know the boundary between what's the torbat haveshet and what's the veshet? So he says, Kosher Tochvo Umarchiv. If you cut it and it widens, that's torbat haveshet. What they're basically going to say is the material that makes up the torbat haveshet is softer, more flexible. So when you, and not only flexible, but expands rather than, right, stays the same or shrinks. So he says, if you cut it, we're going to have two opinions here. If you cut it and it widens, that's the torbat haveshet. If you were to slice it and it stays exactly as it is, then zehu veshet atzmo. That's the veshet. That's how you determine. Again, we're talking about determining it after death, so you can just cut it and see what happens. Amalei Rav Papi, Marlo Amar Hachi. So Rav Papi says, hey, so-and-so didn't say that, what you said. Umanu, who is that so-and-so? Rabbi Bar Abaye. Ela, so what did Rabbi Barabai say? Ela koshachotcho ve'omed bimkomo zeu torbat zaveshet. He says the torbat zaveshet, actually nothing happens when you cut it. It stays exactly as is. Ela izu veshet atzmo. So what's the veshet itself? Koshachotcho ve'kavitz. If you were to cut it, it would shrink. It would, right? It's the best word I can think of. There's a better word. Contract. That's the word I was thinking. It would contract. So basically, they both have the same direction, which is the torbat zaveshet ends up wider than the veshet, but one, because the torbat zaveshet is actually more flexible and widens, where the other one says the veshet stays the same, and the second one is the torbat zaveshet actually doesn't move at all, it's the veshet itself that shrinks, okay, and contracts. So, okay, that's a machloket. Now, Yona, Amar Rabbi Zera, Mivla'ata, okay, he tells you what is this. It's the place where things get swallowed, okay? It's basically saying it's between the jawbone and right, it's this place where things get swallowed in. Okay, Vikama, how large is this area? Okay, now it's going to be teeny, you're going to see. Amar Rav Avya, Pachot misa'arata va'adif michitita. It's a little smaller than a barley and larger than a grain of wheat, okay? So we're talking about a very small area, okay? Now we get to our story, and with this, we're going to end with this very interesting story. And it reminds me of another story in Gittin, which I'll remind you of. You might remember. Ha'u Torah, dahava libnei Rav Ukva. Okay, there was an ox that belonged to the sons of Rav Ukva. Da'atcha b'shchita b'torbat haveshet b'gamar b'veshet. Okay, they started the shchita in the torbat haveshet, and they finished in the veshet. Okay, let's go through the opinions. What would Rav say? Rav would say this is the veshet, so the shchita is fine. And great, the animal's kosher. What would Shmuel say? It's not the area of shchita. It's not okay. But, okay, so the shchita, now the question is, but in the end, you finish the shchita with the veshet. So maybe it's okay. But what's the problem? Well, you have now a nekev, right? Like you have a perforated, what do you have basically? It's like a kosher shchita, but you tore a little bit of the torbat haveshet first. Does that make the animal a treifa? Well, according to Shmuel, only if it's rove, and you didn't cut the majority of the torbat haveshet. So it's not a treifa. You didn't treif up the animal before you slaughtered it, and you did a kosher shchita because in the end you finished up the shchita and the veshet, so it'd be kosher. So Rav and Shmuel would both say it's kosher. What happened though? Amar Rava, Ramina alei chumrei de Rava chumrei de Shmuel v'traf tarifna lei. He says, I'm going to put upon you the chumras of Rav and the chumras of Shmuel, and I'm going to say this animal's a treifa. So he basically says to Rav Ukva's children, throw away the animal, right? You can sell it or something, but you can't use the animal. Okay, chumrei de Rav. What's the chumrei de Rav? Da amarav b'mashu. So they say, right, and then let's just go through. What's the chumrei de Rav? A nekev of any little bit is going to cause the animal to be a treifa. And the chumrah of Shmuel, that this is not a makom shchita. So you have to start really with Shmuel. If it's not a makom shchita, then you have a nekev there, and you basically made a teeny perforation, like Rav. It's a teeny perforation before you slaughtered the animal. You made it a treifa. So now they're going to kind of question and say, wait, chumrei de Rav da amarav b'mashu. So you might say chumrah of Rav because Rav said b'mashu, but ha'amarav makom shchitu. But didn't Rav say that's a makom shchita? So again, as long as it's the place for shchita, you didn't treif up the animal before that. Was just part of the shchita process. We don't say that when you're cutting the windpipe and the gullet, well, you make it a treifa the second before you finish cutting it. No, that's just part of the shchita. So if the torbat haveshet is part of the shchita place, you should be fine. So he says, no, kishmuel, the amar lav makom shchitahu. Okay, they said, no, he must have held like Shmuel, who says it's not makom shchita, and then like Rav, that it was the best. But ila Shmuel ha'amar beruba. But if you're going to hold like Shmuel, he said only in the majority, and you didn't cut the majority of the torbat haveshet. So they answer, kirav the amar b'mashu. Okay, basically, which is what we said before. He holds like Rav in one area, Shmuel in the other, but Rav would never have said that, and Shmuel would never have said that, right? It's just the combo of both each of their chumrot that makes this a problem. I'm going to remind you of the story in Gittin now, where the woman goes to get her ketubah money. Remember, a woman can get mizonot until like a monthly stipend, until she takes her big lump sum of the ketubah. But Shmuel says once you go to court to get your ketubah, you no longer can get mizonot. And Rav said that we don't allow widows to collect their ketubah, because he had an issue that widows were lying and taking these false oaths. And basically she goes to court to get her ketubah, and they say, well, now you can't get mizonot and you can't get your ketubah. You can't get mizonot, because Shmuel says as soon as you come to court to get your ketubah, you lose your rights to mizonot. And Rav says we can't let people get their ketubah money, their big lump sum money. So they left her without nothing, high and dry, and she basically curses the rabbi who did it and says his chair should be overturned, meaning he should die, and he actually dies. They try to overturn his chair to have the curse come true, and he dies because he did that, right? So doing like chumras of two people is not always such a good thing, especially at the expense of someone else. And that's what happened here too. They lost money on this animal because it was slaughtered improperly, according to Rava. But it was really, technically speaking, kosher. So igali milta, okay, I told you we're going to end in an interesting way. Igali milta matai lekame de Rabbi Abba. So story comes up to Rabbi Abba. Here's what happened. It's a little too late at this point. Damage is done. Amar lehu, he says to them, Torah ben l'Rav ben l'Shmuel shari. But Rav would have said it was fine, and Shmuel would have said it was fine. Zilu amar le'leberei de Rabbi Yosef Rachama. Go tell the son of Rabbi Yosef Rachama. They don't even call Rava by name. Go tell the son of Rabbi Yosef Rachama, which is Rava. Dilishalim demei Torah lamari. He has to pay out of pocket to these guys for the loss he caused them. Okay, that's serious, right? Such an error you made that you have to, well, I guess the error in Gitin was much worse, right? He died. At least here he just gets to pay. I'm a marburid ravina, motvina tiyuvte klape sane de Rava. I'm going to bring a contradiction. Okay, I'm going to raise a problem with those who hate Rava, which was just a way of saying with Rava. It's like a way of saying, I don't want to say I'm doing it against Rava, but he was really saying I'm bringing it against Rava. So we call a euphemism. La'olam. So now he's going to quote this source, and we'll get into this tomorrow. I'll just start it today. La'olam hilchata k'divrei Beit Hillel. Okay, we paskin like. Okay, this is basically a braita that talks about how to paskin. We paskin like Beit Hillel. Okay, in general, but actually it's in the Tosefta, in a bunch of Toseftas. This appears a few times. But if you want to do like Beit Shammai, you can. K'divrei Beit Hillel say you can do like Beit Hillel if you want. Bikule Beit Shammai, mikule Beit Hillel rasha. If you hold by each of their leniencies, you're a rasha. Michumre, and what they mean is if, right, you're basically like doing the opposite of what we did here, where you're basically taking neither opinion completely all the way and making a leniency. And michumre Beit Shammai and michumre Beit Hillel, if you take the stringencies of both, like in our case, alav katuv omer haksil b'choshech holech. Okay, the pasuk about you says, pasuk in Mishlei, right, the foolish people walk in the dark. Okay, a foolish person walks in the dark. You're basically being idiotic, okay? And he's basically what he's saying is this shows, okay, and we're going to get to this in tomorrow, there's a few problems with this Tosefta we're going to get into. First, there's an inner contradiction. I don't know if you've caught it, but we'll talk about it tomorrow. In any case, he says, yeah, Rava really makes some sense. So Rabbi Abba basically makes him pay back the money. And Marburid Ravina comes up and says, he completely contradicted this Tosefta, which says, don't take the chumras of both when, right, it doesn't make sense according to either opinion. Okay, so we started with Ulla, who started categorizing them and basically saying there's 8 types of issues that could happen to you. And he was trying to exclude the lakuta, the disease of the kidneys. We have Chiya bar Rav, who said there's 8 kinds of cases of nekuvas. And then we said, right, if you want to say tesha, that's the mara. That's only Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda was trying to exclude that one. And then we got into Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, who says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, we actually paskin like Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda. With that, he brought the conversation, right, about the whole miracle of Iyov. And then we got to 3 other statements he made about the liver, about the liver, if the liver covers up the gallbladder, if the liver is left with less than a kazayit, the problem with that in the Mishnah. We had the korkavan with the inner lining. From there, we got to the veshet with the 2 linings, and we got to Rabbi's whole statement about that. Right, we got it from the gizzard and the 2 linings from Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda. If you want to just see Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, if you want to just see the flow, right? The 4th one of his was about the korkavan with the inner and the outer. So then we talked about the veshet and the inner outer, and there we mentioned a bunch of things with the red and the white, and how you have to check the inside and not the outside, because the inside for a suffix drusa. From there we got to Ulla, who talked about what if you have a coats, right? And we also talked about the difference between the holes and the perforations and all that. I'm not going to get back to that. If you have a hole, a coats, a thorn in making a hole in the inside of the veshet, but not the outside, so do you have to worry that maybe there was something in the outside? And again, by the way, you can't check. That's also part of the problem here. You can't see was there any blood because it's all red outside. And then we got to, 4 difficulties. Why was he lenient here? And then we had another option that maybe he wasn't lenient there. Maybe there was a different way to understand, although Rav Kana didn't like that reading. And from there, we ended with the Torah Tefesha and the Machlok of Rav and Shmuel about the Torah Tefesha, which led to this crazy case where Rava ruled like the stringencies of both, and Rabbi Abba made him return the money. And Marba Ravina said, you completely are contradicting this Tosefta, and we'll get back to that in tomorrow's daf. With that, wishing everyone a good day and a Shabbat Shalom.